From the shadow of war to the weight of history, today we focus on two strategic choices reshaping Western diplomacy and economic policy. In Rome, US and Iranian negotiators turned to the table for a second round of nuclear talks. President Trump's team wants a deal, but only on their terms. Can diplomacy prevail, or are both sides walking to a tightrope towards confrontation? Meanwhile, in the UK, the government's emergency intervention in the steel industry has sparked a furious debate. Is Scunthorpe a symbol of national resilience or just a costly rescue with no clear roadmap? I'm Mona Moselhi. Let's get in focus. The latest round of nuclear talks between the US and Iran opened in Rome this weekend, with Iran enriching uranium to near weapons grade level and the Trump administration demanding a deal stronger than the JCPOA, or the Joint Cooperation Plan of Action. The stakes couldn't be higher. Is there still a pathway to peace? According to foreign policy, history offers lessons and warnings. A former Iranian diplomat argues that a sustainable agreement is still possible, but only if Washington learns from its past failures. The article stresses 5 core principles for success: diplomacy over force, a comprehensive agenda, respect for the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, regional de-escalation, and economic integration. But with President Trump threatening military action and US envoy Steve Witkoff flip-flopping on enrichment caps, confidence is still low and the risk of mass calculation is dangerously high. Now, so now with us to analyze this pivotal moment is Mr. Greg Swinson, political and economic expert and chairman of the Republican Overseas UK. Mr. Greg, good evening to you, sir, and welcome to Qnews. Let me start with your point of view of are we heading towards a new US-Iran deal or towards renewed confrontation and escalation?
Well, that's a great question, Mona, and I think it depends on the regime. It depends on the mullahs. I would hope it's the latter, of course, or sorry, the former, and not the latter. But I think you have to have deterrence. You have to have peace through strength. So there has to be that threat of force. In many ways, it's the same threat that President Trump used in his first term, when he, for example, took out when he dropped out of the JCPOA, which is a very flawed deal. And his sanctions against Iran, for the most part, really worked. They were very effective in reducing the capabilities of the regime in the first term. And so I do think, though, that there has to be negotiations. The US prefers diplomacy, of course, and hopefully the diplomacy will work.
Mm-hmm. Now, while Europe and the other partners of the previous nuclear pact said that it was good enough to build on it, Trump's team insists this must be Trump's deal, not the revival of the JCPOA. Now, is that a smart negotiating posture, or does it complicate diplomacy unnecessarily? What do you think?
I think it's brilliant. I think that would definitely be a red line. The JCPOA only delayed slightly the ability of the regime to acquire to build nuclear weapons, and also it armed the regime, the mullahs, with fresh capital, which they used, of course, to fund their proxies in Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. So, I think in retrospect, it was a disaster of a deal. Why the European countries are still in some way committed to that, I don't understand. But But I do think that we saw, the actual effects of the sanctions in the first term were very effective, and those were relaxed, obviously, in Joe Biden's term. And of course, we had 60 billion of fresh capital in the hands of the regime. So I think we've learned by our mistakes
Let me
collectively.
get that clear of what you're saying. You're saying here that the
Sure.
previous pact did not insist on Iran's and how it deals with its money in funding its proxies,
Yeah.
and it was only focusing on the nuclear issue, while this one focused on all files together, right?
Yeah,
This is what you meant?
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And also the first deal, the JCPOA by President Obama and John Kerry, it only delayed the capabilities of acquiring a nuclear weapon, right? So it kicked the can down the road. So it temporarily, perhaps put on hiatus, although there was not any meaningful testing requirements or inspection requirements. So it was a lot of trust, but don't verify. And of course, as I said, it armed the regime to get to some other, rather mischievous behavior besides the nuclear development in funding the proxies. So, I think President Trump was smart in the first term to understand that and make sure that they were not able to continue funding their proxy militias. And then, of course, President Biden relaxed the sanctions, also did his best to increase oil prices by being very, very hostile to the U.S. energy business or energy industry. That increased oil prices, which only benefited Putin and then the regime in Iran to sell oil at much higher prices. And we saw how that worked out. So I think this is going to be comprehensive. It will require the regime to stop developing a nuclear weapon. But also it will allow the regime to continue developing economic prosperity so that they can be of aid to their own people, which is constructive and also very important to President Trump.
Well, Mr. Greg, foreign policy outlines a long history of missed opportunities from the Atoms for Peace era to Obama's pivots in 2013. Can this legacy be leveraged now to build trust?
Absolutely. I think it can. And I think the president does that through economic diplomacy. He would rather do business with our adversaries than fight our adversaries, within reason. There has to be some understanding that the Iranian regime will not be a threat to our friends, to our allies, or to the US. And whether that's firing missiles from the Houthis on American ships or our allied ships, whether that's threatening Israel with nuclear destruction, any of these things are unacceptable, obviously. But if we can get to a point where the arms are down, the arms are laid down, and we're doing business, we're doing economic diplomacy. President really likes that. He'd much rather do business than do war.
Then let me here talk red lines, right? Iran refuses to halt enrichments, the uranium enrichment. The US wants full cessation. Is there any viable middle ground here?
I don't think so, although I could be surprised if perhaps there is some middle ground where there's, enrichment for peaceful purposes for nuclear energy. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think the mullahs have demonstrated that they have every intention of developing a nuclear weapon. So I would argue that they have plenty of oil in Iran. I'm not sure that they need nuclear power, but there might be some compromise, and I'll leave that to the diplomats. But I think at this point, it's still, as I said, really important that they don't have nuclear weapon capability.
Now, according to the foreign policy article, the article warns that invoking the UN's snapback mechanism could push Iran to leave the non-proliferation treaty. Now, how real is that threat, and what would be the consequences then?
Yeah, I think that would be a big mistake for Iran to leave the agreement. And of course, that's why we need the threat of the Israelis and the Americans taking out their nuclear facilities. There was some argument to be made when Israel took out other facilities a few months back that they should have gone after the nuclear weapon facilities. They didn't. They chose not to escalate. Perhaps that was wise. But the Israelis, the Americans, obviously have the capability to do that. It's not what we want to do. I think that's more of a, perhaps a threat, but it's a credible threat. I think you need peace through strength. You need to have deterrence, and we have that capability. Again, that's not what the Americans want. We want diplomacy, but diplomacy, we want economic cooperation that, again, will be better for the Iranian people who are suffering under this regime and under the sanctions that are necessary because of the regime.
Now, as you wrote about the issue of Israel and its role in the issue, now regional de-escalation is cited as critical at this very particular stage, especially with the Israeli war on Gaza. Now, could a nuclear deal help reduce broader regional instability, do you think?
I think it would. Yeah, absolutely, because that is a very credible threat to Israel and other neighbors as well, other Gulf states and Arab neighbors, but especially to Israel. I think it is a credible threat. If that threat is no longer realistic, then I do think that both parties can move on to some peaceful negotiations. And that's what we saw with the Abraham Accords in President Trump's first term. And those accords have held, which is really interesting. Even after October 7th, the Abraham Accords have continued to hold. It's really important. I think you'll see additional signatories to that deal, to the Abraham Accords. So this is all good news. And as soon as the nuclear capability is taken away, that means that we can move on.
But some of the agreements, were built on the issue of a Palestinian state to alongside with an Israeli one. So it holds as long as the Israeli get back to this. So the question is, would an Iranian deal or agreement reflects on the stability of the region and with terms that can go with all agreements on the ground?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it solves every problem in the Middle East. It takes away one major problem, or I should say two. One is the threat of nuclear war from a regime that's been rather aggressive in the region, and two, it takes away their capabilities to continue funding the proxies. And we've been very pleased in the last year to see the proxies dial down quite a bit. After the strikes on the Houthis, there was really no particular reaction by the Iranian regime. You had the end of the Assad regime in Syria, and that was obviously a close ally or even a puppet state of Iran. That's no longer the case. You've basically seen Hamas and Hezbollah, defeated for the most part, or at least close to defeated, or no longer being, especially with Hezbollah, no longer being a serious threat. So remember, Israel took 300 missiles from Iran in one attack. They were constantly attacked by Hezbollah from the north and continue to be attacked with missiles from Hamas to the south. So there's a lot of work to do in the region.
Definitely the Middle East and what is going on between Israel and Lebanon and in the Palestinian territories is not our main focus now. But just stay with us as we shift to our next segment. And as the Rome negotiations continue, the road to resolution appears narrow but not closed. History shows us that diplomacy can work, but only if both sides truly want it to. As the US seeks to defuse a nuclear crisis abroad, Britain is grappling with its own domestic crisis. The government's dramatic intervention in British steel has reignited debates over national security, state subsidies, and industrial strategy. Let's turn now to Scunthorpe. Now, Britain's lost blast furnaces are no longer in private hands. Following a dramatic standoff with Chinese-owned Jinji, the government stepped in, citing national security, economic sovereignty, and job protection. But with costs spiraling and strategy unclear, Is this intervention visionary or short-sighted? The Economist reports that the government's move to save Scunthorpe's furnaces came with little clarity and large risks. National security is cited, but most UK defence steel is already imported. The plan to revive steelmaking, once a cornerstone of British industry, now risks becoming a costly gamble without clear long-term goals or global competitiveness. Well, back to Mr. Gregg, and thank you so much for being with us again for the second segment. Let me here ask you now. MPs are recalled from recess to save British steel. Was this nationalisation necessary or just political theatre?
Yeah, Mona, I think it was a little bit of both. I do think there was some urgent need to look after British steel. This is something that a problem has been festering for decades now, and so maybe it's a little too late. But I do think something had to be done. There might have been a bit of theater. This is a rare moment where MPs worked on a weekend or worked over a Saturday, and they were kind of bragging about that. I'm not sure that's not going to fall on deaf ears from people and voters who are frustrated with the Labour government. But I do think there was some urgency involved. Look, this is a much longer story. It didn't happen overnight. The steel industry has been suffering, as you quite rightly pointed out. It was a crown jewel of the British economy. And I think while the UK, the United Kingdom, imports most of its steel for national security reasons and for supply chain reasons, I think there is some merit to having a good, a well-functioning steel industry in an industrial country like the United Kingdom. The problem is I would rather have it done in the private sector, not through the public sector. I hope this is temporary in many ways.
Now, the British government, you wrote about the issue of national security, and the British government has already claims of national security demands primary steel production, but most defense steel is already imported.
Yeah.
So does this argument hold up?
Well, it does. I think they can continue importing steel, especially if it's more competitive than the steel they make at home. But I do think you have to have some capability in case there are supply chain issues or any sort of conflict, especially when you're importing steel from your adversaries. And that's very dangerous. So, but again, I'd rather have the private sector be managing that process rather than the government. And also keep in mind this, the government could do much better than taking over and nationalizing an industry. They would be better off liberating their own economy. Right now, British companies are paying 5 times as much for power as American companies do. They're even paying 40% more than German companies do. And we always think of Germany as the poster child for net zero insanity, where they're wrecking their own economy because of these net zero policies. The Brits have done the same thing. They've made it very difficult to generate electricity at home, and there's a ban on fracking natural gas. There's until recently a ban on new oil leases in the North Sea. This is destructive to their own economy. So it doesn't surprise me that British steel was unable to be competitive when they're paying significantly higher prices than their competitors in the West, in the US and in Western Europe. Mm-hmm. So I think they'd be better off liberating their economy than nationalizing an industry.
Right. But the intervention here follows failed negotiations with the Jinji. So should the UK be more concerned about Chinese ownership of critical infrastructure or the critical infrastructure or its own industrial vulnerability?
Yeah, I think they should be concerned with both. And that's why I would encourage them to, again, liberate their own economy. There's a reason why much of the production has fallen into Chinese hands, because it's been very difficult for British companies to operate in the UK. And so they do quite well in the service industries and the service sectors, but not in manufacturing because of the hostile regulatory environment and the hostility to the energy sector. So it's really difficult for these companies to compete. So on one hand, it's important to have British industry, and especially steel production. On the other hand, it's going to be very difficult without liberating the economy first.
Now, there is near political consensus on this move, including even the opposition. So does this reflect national interests or just fear of job losses in key constituencies?
Yeah, no, look, I think it's the former. I think there are serious national security issues. Yeah, and yes, employment is important, and I do think that job losses would be very, very bad for the Labor government. Nobody wants to see that, especially the government in power. But I do think there is consensus here that while we don't like to be in this position, I don't think conservatives or the Reform Party would like to be in the position where they have to nationalize an industry. But in this case, because of the mistakes made over the last 20 or 30 years, that is the only outcome or the only option. There's no good option right now. So again, if hopefully this is temporary, the government will nationalize the industry, but ultimately sell it back to the private sector, privatize it, and at the same time take the parallel path of liberating the economy. That might not be capable. The Labor government might not be able to do that because ideologically they are very, very much for they're for a regulatory regime. They're pro-regulation. They're anti-energy. But that's starting to change a little bit. We're seeing them back away from some of this net zero policy, and we're seeing them deregulate initially in the housing sector. And that's a good sign if they can deregulate in the energy sector as well.
Now, how do you assess the strategic risks of deterring foreign investment with emergency powers and sweeping government control?
Yeah, no, it's always a risk, Mona, and that's why it's such a great question. And I do think that they have to be careful of that. But I think you can have two different types of foreign direct investment. You can have FDI from your allies, and you can have FDI from your adversary. And clearly, China is an adversary. They've shown that with their mercantilist economic behavior around the world. So I think it's quite fair for a government to say, yes, we love investment, but no, not from the Chinese at this moment.
Finally, here, if the government wants to invest in economic resilience, are there more productive sectors than blast furnace steel?
Yes, there are. I mean, I think any wise investor would want to be in new economies, invest in AI, invest in technology, invest in fintech, which the UK has been a leader in. And so I think there are other industries, but you still need the traditional legacy industries to a certain degree. You still need steel. You still need to generate energy. And so again, you really can't start to have meaningful foreign direct investment or any investment in artificial intelligence or data centers or anything like it without an efficient energy production, right? It's 5 times the cost. So why would you open a data center, which is very high energy or requires high energy? Why would you open a data center in the United Kingdom and pay 5 times what you'd pay in the US for energy and face a regulatory burden? That's why entrepreneurs are not moving to Great Britain right now. Entrepreneurs and wealth are moving to the United States. They're moving to the UAE. They're moving to Singapore, where regulations are not as burdensome, where capital is welcome and success is not taxed at obscene levels like it is in the UK and the rest of Western Europe.
All right. Mr. Greg Swinson, we thank you so much for being with us again in this next second segment. And let me tell you, happy Easter for you. And back to our conclusion here, as Britain grapples with its industrial legacy, this Scunthorpe decision could define more than just the future of steel. It may test the limits of state-led economic revivals. And from Rome's fragile nuclear diplomacy to the UK's high-stakes steel gamble, this moment underscores how national power, whether military or industrial, is being redefined across the continent. Are we entering an era of renewed national purpose or repeated policy overreach? We'll keep tracking the story right here in Focus.